Welcome to CT Strategies Unpacked, a podcast that explores insider perspectives of global trade and customs and border management. In this leadership series, we will talk to current and former trade professionals to get a layer deeper than regulation and enforcement. In today's segment, our host, Erik Moncayo, sits down with former CBP officials Allen Gina, Charles Bartoldus, and Ron May to reflect on the defining day of 9/11, bringing their individual stories from unique corners of CBP together to discuss how their lives and their roles in CBP were impacted by that pivotal event. Recorded live on September 24th, 2021, this is the second podcast in the CTS Meet the Team series.
Good day to everybody. My name is Erik Moncayo with CT Strategies. This is a special podcast we'd like to share with you. We have members of our team that were working for what used to be the legacy agencies that became Customs and Border Protection. Now that we've been able to honor the memories of the tragedy of 9/11, we want to commemorate that tragedy by sharing a conversation of what we went through at the time. So just to set the scene for the conversation, on September 11, 2001, at 7:59, American Airlines Flight 11, a Boeing 767 with 92 people aboard, takes off from Boston Logan International Airport en route to Los Angeles. At 8:14 a.m., United Airlines Flight 175, a Boeing 767 with 65 people aboard, takes off from Boston. It is also headed to Los Angeles. At 8:19 a.m., flight attendants aboard Flight 11 alert ground personnel that the plane has been hijacked. American Airlines notifies the FBI. At 8:20, American Airlines Flight 77 takes off from Dulles International Airport outside of Washington, D.C. A Boeing 757 is headed to Los Angeles with 64 people on board. At 8:41 a.m., United Airlines Flight 93, a Boeing 757 with 44 people on board, takes off from Newark International Airport en route to San Francisco. It had been scheduled to depart at 8 a.m. at the same time as the other hijacked flights. 8:46 a.m., Mohammed Atta and the other hijackers aboard American Airlines Flight 11 crashed the plane into the floors 93 through 99 of the North Tower of the World Trade Center, killing everyone on board and hundreds inside the building. At 9:02 a.m., after initially instructing the tenants of the World Trade Center South Tower to remain in the building, Port Authority officials broadcast orders to evacuate both towers via public address system. An estimated 10 to 14,000 people are already in the process of evacuating. 1 minute later, at 9:03 a.m., hijackers crashed United Airlines Flight 175 into floors 75 through 85 of the World Trade Center's South Tower, killing everyone on board and hundreds inside the building. 9:37 a.m., hijackers aboard Flight 77 crashed the plane into the western facade of the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., killing 59 people aboard the plane and 125 military and civilian personnel inside the building. At 9:59 a.m., the South Tower of the World Trade Center collapses. 10:07 a.m., after passengers and crew members aboard hijacked Flight 93 contact friends and family and learn about the attacks in New York and Washington, they mount an attempt to retake the plane. In response, the hijackers deliberately crashed the plane into a field in Somerset County, Pennsylvania, killing all 40 passengers and crew on board. 10:28 a.m., the World Trade Center's North Tower collapses 102 minutes after being struck by Flight 11. As we mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, all of us were working for the government at the time. With us today is Allen Gina, Charles Bartoldus, Ron May, and myself, Erik Moncayo. So tell us, Mr. Gina, where were you and what were you doing the morning of 9/11?
Sure. Well, thank you, Erik, and thank you for recounting the incidents for our listeners to understand the severity and the pain that each of us are still feeling, 20 years later. But I was in Washington, D.C., at Customs headquarters at the time. And I was working in an office that used to be called anti-smuggling, and we were working for Mr. John McGowan, and at that time I was head of outbound programs. And when the incident happened, I remember Mr. McGowan putting on the television in his office and us being made aware of what was transpiring, and just immediately thinking, having started my career at JFK Airport and having been born and raised in New York City, of the tragedy and the family and the friends and the colleagues, that were immediately being impacted, and how many of those individuals might have been in the tower that I personally knew, or that I know others that I know probably had some relationship with. But then it got even worse when we actually saw on the TV the second plane hitting the tower. And then it was further magnified when just across the river, a short distance away from where we were, the plane that ultimately flew into the Pentagon. And, I think just trying to think through the emotion as to, what is this now done in changing not only the world and the US, but what we in the US Customs Service were responsible for doing relative to protecting, the borders of our nation. And as I got through that, I think it became even more concerning, because all of a sudden it became known to me that 6 World Trade Center was damaged, if not completely crushed, when one of the towers collapsed. And many people who are listening may not know 6 World Trade Center is where the New York, New Jersey, field headquarters office for Legacy Customs was there. The only thing I know I'm being reminded of from Miss Susan Mitchell, that when the first incident of the World Trade Centers, and I believe it was the explosion in maybe the parking garage, Susan kept reminding us that due to John Martouge, who was the district director at the time, that was the structure we had before, transitioning into the current Customs and Border Protection structure. He was so serious about, the fire drills and the severity of what could possibly happen, and how to be diligent and make sure everybody adheres to those fire drills. And you know what? I can understand that, because half the time when the fire alarms went off in the Ronald Reagan building, how many people didn't want to get out of their chair or their office, and it's just a drill. But because of his diligence, we'll never really know, but not one customs person, died in that horrific event on 9/11, to his decision to make sure everybody adhered to that. But yeah, it was exceptionally emotional. As you can hear, our listeners may not realize we just watched a video, so the emotion, was all brought back. But important to be brought back, and important to be reminded how significant the CBP mission is, and the mission of every other first responders and individuals that are helping to protect national security.
Yes, absolutely. And that tower, and in preparation for this conversation, I did a lot of research on the topic, and it caught fire later in the day because what was happening at the north and south tower, but it had been evacuated in the morning. And so when it came crumbling down at 5:00 p.m., luckily there was no one left in the building. And so at least in that respect, there were no immediate fatalities when that structure collapsed. Mr. Bartoldus, tell us where you were on 9/11.
Thank you, Eric. I appreciate it. On 9/11, in the morning of 9/11, I was the district port director of Baltimore, responsible for customs operations in the Maryland area, just north of Washington, D.C. I was in a meeting with our field director that day, going over the top 10 items for the district, the things that I thought were most important. His secretary interrupted the meeting soon after the first crash and notified us that a plane had gone into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. I used to work in the World Trade Center in 6 World Trade Center, as Mr. Gina referred, the customs headquarters in the New York, New Jersey area. So I had many friends there at the time. Being a New Yorker, I assumed it was a small airplane and nothing big. We continued our meeting, and then she came in 30 minutes later or so and told us that a second plane had hit the other tower. At that point, we knew things had changed. We ended our meeting and across the street and went back to the district port office in Baltimore. Met with my senior people. We put on the TVs in the conference rooms, started checking our operations to continue seaport and airport operations as we thought would need. We soon found out that there was the Pentagon hit and that there was a 4th plane in the air. We had had an incident about 2 weeks previous where some people were caught videotaping inside the customs area when it was closed. So with a 4th plane in the area, although we did not think Baltimore was a target, we decided to evacuate the terminals. At this time, planes were being put down around the world, heading to the United States. So we knew we would not have any more airport operations, but we did have seaport operations. As a senior official in the Customs House, which also had customs agents and U.S. Coast Guard and FDA offices, I was responsible for the entire building. The police department notified us that a panel truck had been parked hastily along the side of the building, and the driver ran away from the truck. So decided, with the encouragement of the police, to shut down all operations in the building, to evacuate everybody and tell everybody to go home. At this point, we re-established operations in the seaport in our command center, and we kept the ships coming in, kept receiving manifests as we needed to, but basically shut down operations and continued to watch the TVs and see what was going on that day.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I have a couple of follow-up questions, but before we get to those questions, Mr. May, tell us about what was going on 9/11 in your world.
Well, it was interesting. I was assigned to pre-clearance, so I was not in the country. I was at Toronto, Canada, which, and my statistics may be off, but 4th largest airport in North America. We would process 1,300 to 1,500 passengers an hour during a very busy day. So again, when this happens, I'm not in the United States, and very upsetting to not be home. Sorry.
Nope. No,
You're good, Ron.
you're good. I can relate to what you're thinking and going through.
As can I. So I'll share my situation on 9/11. So at that time, I was a supervisory border patrol agent assigned to Douglas, Arizona. And for those who've never seen lovely Douglas, Arizona, it is in the southeast corner of Arizona, right up against the New Mexico border. Population, I think at the time, was maybe 12,000 people. And I was on the early morning shift. And so in order to get to work, I was usually on the road by 5 o'clock in the morning to be in at 6. And so when I rolled into my office at 6 o'clock in the morning, bear in mind that at the time, the internet, especially for federal employees, was not something that was easily accessible. You needed to be a member of the IT department or have some special access code to be able to connect to the internet. And even then at the time, not a lot of people had internet in their homes, at least in Arizona at the time. We didn't have cable TV at the station that I worked at. So when I walked in, I was logging in and getting everything situated. And then my boss walks in and tells me a plane just crashed into the World Trade Center. And just like Charlie said, I just immediately assumed that it was just an accidental, some Cessna or something just veered off course and just clipped the World Trade Center, thinking novice pilot or maybe someone flying had a heart attack or whatever. And so I thought to myself, I was like, those buildings are pretty sturdy, so yeah, I'm sure everything will be fine, but that's unfortunate. So a little while later, he comes back into my office and he says, another plane just crashed into the other building. And it was that moment that a chill came over me. And I realized that our country was under attack. And for the first time in my life, that was happening. And as we all can, I'm sure, appreciate, you grow up thinking and believing that America is the world's superpower. I know that we've had many years where we were considered to be one of the superpowers, but at least in our history books, very rarely is there a story about the times we've lost wars. But at that moment, that was the first time in my life that I had seen someone attack us at that magnitude on our own soil. And it was in that moment that I understood that we were at war. And as we were trying to reconcile with the emotions of all that, I called my wife, and she was getting ready for work. And by now it's 7:30 in the morning or what have you. I called my wife, and she's crying, and she says, and I told her, are you seeing what's happening? She says, yes, a plane just crashed into the Pentagon. And I said, no, it's the World Trade Center. She's like, no, I'm watching it. A plane just crashed into the Pentagon. And so we had to put on an FM radio in our office. And at that point, the radio station that played country music, because that was the only radio station in that town, had transitioned all of their formatting for the day just to cover the news of the day. And so we were all glued to this FM radio station because we were able to try to connect to the internet, but internet was down, phones were down everywhere. And so the page on the screen would take an hour to load. And so every hour you would be able to see a new graphic of explosions, of smoke, of fire, of people running through the streets. But we were basically, we were living behind the times in Arizona because of the lack of connectivity we had to real-time events. And so I was waiting to be updated by the radio or waiting to be updated by my wife throughout the day. And the entire day you're expecting more attacks. You're expecting more attacks as when the plane crashed in Pennsylvania. We assumed that was it. And there was obviously a lot of things that were happening. And I know, Charlie, you alluded to one of them, box truck, someone fleeing. For us, everything of suspicion became a possible threat. Whereas up to that point, I feel, at least in my world, that we didn't take a lot of these threats seriously enough. Because as I've learned over the years, and especially preparing for this conversation, there were so many indications of what was to come that were dismissed, not seen, or not heeded. But first and most importantly, not connected. So, Ron, let me start with you. You mentioned being away from home, and I feel like if I can at least make an assumption of what we were going through, and it's like what I'm going through, it's being in Arizona, I felt like I needed to be in the fight, that I needed to defend our country somehow, some way. And if I can't do it from Arizona, you need to send me somewhere where I can. And that was kind of what I was going through at the time. So Ron, let me start with you. What did you feel that we needed to do at that moment?
Well, I can say that instantly. I started in Legacy Customs in 1987. And the way we do our job, or did our job, changed at that moment. Everything that we had known, everything, our objectives kind of turned on its ear. I think one of the things that I was, exposed to right away is being out of country is the communication with a foreign component in an effort to unify, to figure out what to do. So the northern border, the Canadian border, the airports, working with RCMP, working with Canadian Customs, working with Ontario Provincial Police Department, getting to talk to each other, because everybody's like, what's happening? What's going on? What are we going to do? What's our next step? I mentioned the airport. Sometimes we would have 1,300 passengers in the U.S. Customs area an hour. It was empty. There was no flights. There were some personnel, but you had in the Canadian and Toronto International Airport patrols of RCMP fully armored and having MP5s, with everybody, wondering, where are we supposed to go? What are we supposed to do? I think one of the interesting things also is, we mentioned aircraft. They put everybody on the ground. So you had planes landing in Canada at places that weren't meant to handle these large aircraft. It was just get everybody out of the sky. Let's figure out what's going on. The border itself, as many of us remember, basically stopped. I remember talking to friends. I started in Detroit, and they were saying that we're not processing traffic. It's not that they were doing it slowly. They weren't processing traffic. It stopped. So everything we had known to do, everything we were, I'll say the word trained, but the mission had to be changed. So for us, what do we do in a foreign component, the pre-clearance? Because we're in a foreign country clearing passengers so that when they get to the United States, they don't have to go through customs. Now, what are we looking for? We're starting to look for more information on terrorism, more information on what a person's doing, more information on what the relationship that person has with someone else, and starting to expand. And I think one of the things I'm sure we'll get to, because Charlie has extensive experience in the targeting arena, Al has outstanding long-term experience in reaching out globally, but trying to get that not only connectivity with our foreign components, but with each other. Making immigration talk better to customs talk better to Secret Service, DEA. And I think, Erik, you and I have talked about this. Unfortunately, massive negative events bring about change. And in many ways, I hate to use the term positive change, but that ability to, at least in my little part of the world and outside the United States, was okay. I'm going to start making the reclamation to get us back on track, start adjusting my job so that I'm paying attention to those things now that are at the top of the list. I don't know I'm sure everyone has other experiences.
Well, Erik, if you'll allow me to expand on what Ron was saying very quickly, and then Charlie will complement what I have to say. But for our listeners, I think what Ron was describing is that for 200 plus years, the Customs Service was trying to prevent things from entering the country, narcotics or anything else that might do us harm or that was illicit. And I think that was shared throughout customs services around the world. 9/11 clearly stated that, the threat doesn't have to be something coming into the country. It could be people coming in that turned numerous commercial aircrafts into weapons of mass effect. And as Ron alluded to, Charlie and I, being in that headquarters arena, had the pleasure of serving Commissioner Bonner, who, people can argue, right person at the right time, right? Does the moment make the man? Does the man make the moment? I would have to say it was the perfect individual, because Ron alluded to, and then, Charlie will finish this. But to this day, 20 years later, he knew exactly what needed to be done besides continuing to run the agency and make sure cargo and the economic prosperity and competitiveness of our nation was upheld. But there were 5 things that he challenged us on immediately and implemented. And one was, how do we know our capability to target and identify risks are equal amongst the 300 ports of entry? And they weren't. And he said, we need to fix that even the 2-person port in a remote location has the same capability as a port the size of JFK or LAX or Miami. And Ron alluded to the National Targeting Center was ultimately born, and I'll let Charlie give the explanation as to what that is, since he's considered the grandfather of that facility and capability. He also realized we weren't getting enough information, that we needed to be much smarter in analyzing and doing some kind of risk assessment against people, conveyances, and cargo entering our country. And he incorporated the 24-hour rule. And again, there's some nuances to it, but it just meant we needed information in advance. And we needed a better way to examine things coming into the country, and it was through the non-intrusive inspection capabilities, or otherwise known as DNII office. And we needed to do something to get earlier into the supply chain, into an area where we had no authority, where it was basically dependent on other sovereign countries partnering with us. But we created a container security initiative program, which during one phase of my career I had the pleasure of overseeing, where we ultimately placed personnel at 58 locations around the world to try to identify that threat earlier. And then lastly, while we were doing various industry partnership programs, the commissioner, enhanced that by creating the Ctpat program, Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism. And I'll defer to Mr. May, who is a subject matter expert because of his extensive experience in working and running that program. And yeah, it completely changed how we did business and the manner in which we did the business based on this new threat. So I'll defer to Charlie to kind of add to what he experienced, other than me volunteering him as my good friend and taking him away from that very plush location in a historic customs house in Baltimore. He may have a different opinion of how that all transpired.
If you could, Charlie, just tell us about, you mentioned it in one of our earlier conversations, is how you were able to start connecting dots at the earliest stages of this event.
Okay, thank you again. One of the things we haven't talked about yet is prior to 9/11, analytical units were in all of the ports, looking at either cargo or people. In this fledgling program, looking to determine who's coming into your port who may have drugs or contraband or all the rest, they developed an expertise of identifying people who did not belong on planes, who were not tourists or businessmen or families on vacation and all the rest. So on 9/11 in the Port of Baltimore, as well as in other ports, the analytical units at the airports logged on to the airline computers because it was a new program. We were still using airline computers. We had not connected them all to customs yet. And they looked at the domestic flights, and they identified within the 4 flights in the air that came down and were used as terrorist weapons, there were 19 passengers who did not belong on those planes. 19 people who just did not fit the profile for the way they made their reservations, the way they were traveling together, the way they were all going to Los Angeles or the West Coast from the East Coast. And they were able to report up quickly through the customs organization to Commissioner Bonner and ultimately to the White House that there were 19 people who did not belong. And I think that's one of the reasons that the US knew right away that there were 19 hijackers. This capability was very programmed to look at port operations on the port level. And as Mr. Gina referred to, and as Commissioner Bonner identified very quickly, this was an expertise at various levels throughout the country, but we did not have a national effort to look at people on a national level for terrorism reasons. We had capabilities to look for narcotics in Baltimore, so on and so forth, but not for a national threat. So Mr. Gina, Mr. Commissioner Bonner put together the Office of Border Security, which ultimately I came down and worked in, and then managed, and then we became over time the National Targeting Center. Many of us will remember that not long after September 11th, in November, there was a flight out of JFK Airport that crashed soon after takeoff off the coast of Long Island, off the Rockaways. Our analytical unit at the Office of Border Security, soon to become the National Targeting Center, quickly looked at the passenger manifest and were able to identify that there was nothing unusual about that plane, that it appeared to be a horrible accident. We later on learned that it was a rudder on the plane, a mechanical failure that caused the crash. But we reported through Commissioner Bonner to the White House and to others that we believed that this was not a terrorist threat. And that night when the president went on the news, he was able to say, we believe this was a horrible accident. So we were quickly identifying the ability to use risk management and the basic tools to identify threats to the United States on a national level. And that's what we used to build out the concept for the National Targeting Center.
So let me share a couple of stories with the three of you. So in the Border Patrol, we spent, much like any other police agency, we spent the bulk of our time trying to catch bad people doing bad things. And I use the verb catch because prevent was not a verb that was strongly used in our mission set up to that point. In the Border Patrol, you go to the academy for 4 months, 20 weeks. You're there getting trained and on all sorts of things. And one of which is a heavy part of the workload there, is immigration law. And you learn all the different ways that people can legally enter the United States using, permissions and visas and things of that nature. But once you get out into the field, you don't use those techniques very often. Because usually it's readily apparent when someone's committing a crime, and it sticks out like a sore thumb. And using a cop analogy, when you see someone running out of a grocery store with a bunch of things in their hands, you can kind of make the inference that they're up to something and they deserve a follow-up conversation. And in the Border Patrol, because of the nature of the environment that we work in, we oftentimes came into situations where it was obvious that people were smuggling drugs or people were trying to enter the country illegally, and you take the actions accordingly. But we would every now and again set up checkpoint operations. And for us, the legal requirements is that those checkpoints needed to be within 75 miles of the border. And we would do it in different places in my region based on trends. And near Douglas, Arizona is Tombstone, Arizona. And it's the infamous Tombstone, Arizona. And we would set up a checkpoint there on occasion. And we always enjoyed working that checkpoint, because contrary to everywhere else that we would set up checkpoints, you'd get some interesting people that would come through because they were coming to see Tombstone. They wanted to go see the OK Corral. They wanted to walk the streets of Tombstone, Arizona. And so you would get some interesting tourists. You get Canadians, you get Italians, you get all sorts of folks. And that was one of the few times that you actually, as a Border Patrol agent back then, got the opportunity to review a passport, ask some immigration questions, basically, ask some probing questions to make sure that these folks are legitimately entitled to continue their travels. But one of the things that was interesting about that corner of the world is that there was a very small college there, a very, very small college there. And we never really understood why anybody would outside of the area would ever go to that college, because it was so small. It was the tiniest college I've ever seen. But they had an air program there. They had their own runway, and one of the main doctrines in that school was pilot training. And so when I would work these checkpoints in Tombstone, I remember on Friday nights, in addition to the folks that live in Southern Arizona that want to go up to Phoenix for the weekend or what have you, you get a lot of those conversations. But I remember that we would get Middle Eastern students. They were going to that school, getting flight training. And this is in 1999. This is in the year 2000. And so we would be talking to these folks from the Middle East, befuddled as to why, of all the countries in the world and of all the colleges in the world, they wanted to pick this tiny little college in the corner of Arizona to get their pilot's license. And it made no sense to us, but their documents were in order. And so we would let them on their way. And that became something that I kind of logged away in the back of my mind. In addition to that, when I talk about people doing bad things, we would manually track people that were doing bad things. And when I say manually, is that we would fill out an index card and put it in a box, in a shoebox, and keep it on a countertop. Or we would take a Polaroid picture and we would pin it to the cork board in our processing room. And that was our database, quote unquote, to track bad people. And the way that we would go back and I figure out if someone was up to no good is that we would go and compare them to the Polaroids on the wall, or flip through the index cards in the shoebox to see if somebody had written up an index card on this person. And it all came back to the same thing. The name matches, or a physical match that I was able to use based on a Polaroid and the person standing in front of me. But we quickly realized that we had zero connectivity to the port of entry, to the state and local police, to the FBI, the fact that we were not collecting fingerprints on anybody. We were beholden to the fact that the name that they told us and the biographic information that they used, their name and date of birth, was accurate. And I can't tell you how many times we stumbled across information that seemed interesting at the time, but not noteworthy. And I say interesting but not noteworthy because you catch a group of folks from Latin America trying to cross illegally, and there's 2 folks in there from Pakistan in the group, or there's 1 person in there from Bangladesh, or there's someone in there from some random country in there. Or you don't catch the group, and as you're going through the trash that they left behind, you find a Quran. And so in southern Arizona, in the hills, mountains, and deserts of southern Arizona, those are not things that you see on commonly. But again, because we were operating in a world that lacked interconnectivity, these were all things that we were encountering that we had no idea what they meant. And so I literally this week went back and tried to research all those 19 people to make sure that I didn't encounter any one of them. And as far as I know, I didn't. But they did get their pilot's license in Arizona. A few of them went to Phoenix, went to Mesa, and that's where they got their pilot's license. All of them came through a port of entry. All of them had encounters with local PD. And as we've all learned since then, and you started the conversation, Charlie, we knew who they were very quickly. But more importantly, we knew what they were about within days. We knew within days who was behind this. But I think that for me was what I took away from those events, is that we were sitting on so much information that was not being connected, that was not being correlated, not being coalesced, not being synthesized, and more importantly, not being put in the hands of folks that could do something about it, that we were operating in the blind. And much like everyone else on this call, our mission changed fundamentally that day. And you talk, sir, about does the man make the moment or the moment make the man? My boss at the time was David Aguilar. And I remember being on a conference call with him that morning, and his words, he's like, ladies, gentlemen, make no mistake, we are under attack. This is the moment that you've been trained for. This is the moment where we need to stand up and defend our country. You know what we have to do, and we're going to do it. And then we set the wheels in motion to take control of our corner of the world, to make sure that nothing bad happened in our corner of the world. And I remember that at the time, we needed to hear those words. We needed that strength. We needed that confidence. We needed that reassurance that we were not going to die from this, and the world as we knew it was not coming to an end. But we were going to be ready to transition to our new mission immediately. And we talked about how our mission changed. And I think pre-clearance is an important key to that. And so the mission of pre-clearance was to get people into the country faster. So Ron, from pre-clearance to Ctpat, how did our mission change after 9/11?
So I think a couple of keys to the conversation that relate to the pre-clearance question. I think one of the things you've all discussed is, this is going to sound a little odd, but we nationalized the Customs Service. We started to connect the different ports. Some ports had outstanding passenger analysis units. Some maybe did not. But I think it's very telling when Charlie talks about they're not doing the same thing. They may not have the same concept. So we nationalized customs. Then we started to integrate, Eric, what your point is about different agencies. I was on the ATF Bomb Council in Houston for years, and we'd all get together for breakfast once a month, state police, local police, ATF, and we'd talk about things we'd seen and, kind of pass along ideas. And it was a nice way to kind of, hey, I heard this or you heard that, but it wasn't formalized. It wasn't something that was put together. And I think we've started to encourage that. The more important thing, and this goes with pre-clearance, is we started to globalize customs. We started to connect the dots globally. Instead of waiting to see what's coming out of Germany, and Mr. Gina knows this, we put people in Germany. We put customs personnel working with that customs administration to look at cargo that was going on vessels in Bremerhaven. We put people in La Spezia, Italy, to look at what was happening there. We started to globalize the Customs Service, and my being stationed as a U.S. Customs officer in Toronto, Canada. I lived in Canada. I worked in Canada, looking at people to allow them to get to the United States and and go about their business without being reviewed again, that concept now was expanded hugely to look at not only people, but cargo, supply chains around the world, and starting to globalize and connect with companies. Companies import, Eric, some of the countries you mentioned, Bangladesh, India, Vietnam, the Middle East, all over the world. That means products coming. Those companies may know or have information they can provide to us about what that area is like that we don't have. So suddenly we're starting to become educated about the world and about the globe. And I think, you always, bad things sometimes born good things. Well, it made us better. I have to say, I mean, the agency became very adept. Obviously we changed with the DHS, but the ability to look at things before they got to our borders, pushing out the borders, establishing connectivity with other countries and their administrations. So now we can say, hey, there's something not right here in Israel. Can you look at this for us and exchange some information and work together? So that ability to pre-screen, look at the very outreaching points, and Ctpat program, we look at the supply chain from point of origin all the way to the point of delivery. So when a pair of tennis shoes is put in a container in Jakarta, Indonesia, we want to know how they're put in the container, how the container is sealed, how the container is kept secure. Then when it's taken from there to the yard, before it's put on the vessel, how the vessel secures it, how when it gets to Savannah and it's offloaded, how does Savannah, all those components are part of what we try to do. The last thing I'll say, I think that should give encouragement is, in a post 9/11 era, for us to be able to go back to our way of doing things and make the border open, we've also found a way to facilitate it. In this day and age, you're processing and clearing quicker than you did prior to 9/11. It's because we have things in place. But for the ability for the agency to now say, we have these programs to identify lower risk travelers, lower risk cargo. Therefore, not only does the border process at a rate that allows for economic prosperity, but we're actually facilitating it. And I think that's something to be proud of.
No, you raise great points, Ron, and I'm sure many listeners are wondering, how was the agency able to do that when you don't have any authorities overseas? And I think there's several aspects that caused us to have to rethink how we did business and rethink the authorities that we did have and how we could put that to the advantage of our objectives. So one was, we worked with, as Ron indicated, the U.S. importers. And as in any just basic community policing, we realized we can create force multipliers by asking those importers to please put in place requirements which would make their supply chain more secure, which in turn would make a higher level of confidence of anything entering into the United States. And then with the foreign governments, I will have to say they were very, very cooperative, because they knew we were so interconnected that any kind of economic harm to the U.S. was going to be an economic harm to them, who were shipping most of their product to the U.S. And then the carriers. So I want to preface that everybody supported us. But when we sat at the table and said, well, what happens when people don't support us? When we have this do not load order, that you're not to put that container on the vessel, or you're not to come to the U.S. with that type of shipments or cargo. We quickly realized, if you went to tell a carrier, you could do whatever you want in that sovereign country, but when you traverse across the Pacific Ocean or the Atlantic Ocean, either the Commandant of the Coast Guard is going to deny you access into U.S. international waters, or if you do make it to the port of entry, the Commissioner of the Customs Service is going to deny you the unladen, or that means, for those not familiar with that jargon, the offloading of that container. And any carrier is going to be like, well, first of all, I'm not going to carry a container all the way to the other side of the world, to have to carry it back. But even more so, they were saying, Customs is not doing this just to inconvenience us. If they're concerned about a container, we don't want it on our vessel anyway. So there were authorities that we had that we just never looked at in certain ways that made us rethink of how to do that. I think Mr. Bartoldus was going to add something.
Yeah, and follow up to that discussion. I think one of the things after 9/11, we looked at what information did we have, what data did we have, what was the compliance level, and how do we work with the trade to raise the compliance level. The 24-hour rule, the do not load rule, and all the rest. Many people forget that it took us a year to fully implement that. That year we spent talking to the trade. Compliance levels, when we first started looking at what did the data look like, compliance was extremely low. We had very bad information. Originally, if you put a period or the word "the" in the description format, the computer would accept that as a valid description. So we worked with the trade to decide what were valid descriptions, what level of data did we need. We didn't need to know enough data to for somebody to target a container to be ripped off at a port. But we needed enough that if we did an NII examination, we knew what we were looking at when we saw the screen. So in a very strategic effort to work with the trade, we were able to lower or raise compliance rates dramatically in the last few months before the rule went fully effective. On the day that we went fully effective, the week before, we were having hundreds of violations of non-compliance. And on the day that we went full implementation, I was sitting there at the National Targeting Center, turned the computer on, turned it on to automatically denied loading to anything that was not compliant. And we had full compliance because the trade knew that in the previous weeks, we said, you have a problem in this port, you have a problem here, you have a problem with this office. So they were able to raise their compliance levels. Additionally, on do not load, one ship did sail to the United States without compliance to the 24-hour rule. And we turned one ship away. It was coming from the Caribbean, wasn't a long sail, but that's all we had to do. Just one ship setting the rules, saying, no, you can't come in, you violated the rules. That then told everybody that they know how to track, they know how to ensure compliance, and they will live to the letter of the law when they need to. After that, everything worked perfectly. I also want to mention that prior to 9/11, the transmission of passenger manifest to the Customs Service was not required before the plane landed. So we implemented a system working with the carriers to get the information. We went from 20% to 40% to 95% compliance within a matter of weeks and months, because everybody knew this is what we needed to do to ensure quick turnaround of legitimate passengers, continuation of trade, and protection of the United States from on a security level. So that partnership, that analysis, that follow through was all important to making a secure and livable United States.
So two questions for the group. What I was going to ask is, how much of this compliance would you think is attributed to the fact that we shut down our borders on 9/11 and the subsequent days, in addition to the fact that we had been attacked and we were all in this together? So I'll open it up for conversation for the three of you.
Well, I'll just give you this thought that sometimes people feel too much enforcement, too much security is being done, and they are advocating and petitioning for people to reduce that. Then, unfortunately, I think as Ron and I think Erik, you're alluding to, a major incident happens. This 9/11 catastrophic incident happens. And then you may get out of that, why aren't you doing more security? Why aren't you making us safer? So we did have that momentum that people realized maybe the procedures and the protocols that were being employed by the US government at large may not have been adequate to prevent the current threat stream, and we needed to enhance it. And I will have to say, my concern is as we get further and further away from that event, hopefully people are mindful that we can't become complacent and we can't become so lax that all of a sudden we make ourselves vulnerable to another significant, because the bad actors are out there and they're constantly thinking on how to beat the good actors, which I'd like to believe are the law enforcement and intelligence community actors. And it's not going away.
Well, Al brings up a great, part that we CBP Customs tried to establish a relationship with our, and I'll use the term customers, people that we serve, we work with, the trade. The trade educated us as to what we were trying to look for as well. The phenomena that began to happen is as we injected ourselves via the Ctpat program, CSI, some other programs, into those supply chains and into the working mechanisms of those companies, yes, they had to do more things to make it more secure, but they also became more facilitated. They started to become even more competitive. And you see now, for example, you can go to companies and they'll ask, for example, if you're not a Ctpat, they won't do business with you. Now, that's not a mandatory rule for the government. That's just a decision by the company to say, we look upon this program as being so essential to our overall security and facilitation that if you're not part of it, we're not doing business with you. So this effort that we've pushed out to start after 9/11 has qualified the world to understand that we need to tighten things up. We need to have better interconnectivity, and not only something that we've done with the government, but the trade and the private sector has done it as well. And this all put it together in what today, and I'll say again, very pleased and proud that the fact that we have any people traveling anywhere in the world, that we have cargo, my wife can get on Amazon and order something and have it at the house in 24 hours. That's incredible that we can do that in a post 9/11 environment when, as you said, Eric, I can remember, my friend in Detroit saying, yeah, I'm working 12 hours on, 6 hours off. And the border's basically, every time a car or truck comes up, we search everybody, the whole thing. And the border's backed up back in Detroit for hours and hours and hours. You can't sustain that. It'll crush the economy of the company or the country. So a lot of these things have led to this intercommunication, this development of, I'll use the word too, a little bit of trust amongst all the components. And in the old days, it was more, I'm trying to beat you at something or find something you're trying to beat me. Now it's, we get a lot of intelligence and information from the trade itself. They help us. So I don't know. I'm sure Charlie has other things to say about that.
Now, I was going to comment on partnerships also, that everybody plays a role, whether it be the passenger giving the information to the airline giving it to us, the person writing the invoice and the manifest for the cargo. Providing that data clearly and accurately ensures that legitimate cargo and people travel unimpeded and raises the ability to determine the outliers. I think after 9/11, we became a lot more professional in Customs, INS, ultimately CBP. We set standards much higher than they ever been set before. We worked more closely with the trade to ensure that these things move forward legitimately and properly. And I think we're a lot better off than we've ever been before. But it's always a challenge and something we always have to stay ahead of. I smiled when Mr. Gina made a comment about complacency, because that's one of the notes I have on my list of what are the enemy of the good or the enemy of the future. Complacency is one of those things. We have to constantly know that our enemies are out there, they're looking for opportunities, and they only need one opportunity. We have to be good at all times.
One last point, Eric, I have to compliment another commissioner. And you alluded to Mr. Aguilar, who I believe is just an absolute great American and an absolute equally great person. And I feel very blessed to have been able to serve under him as well. But for me, I'll point this at myself, and maybe other CBP employees can reflect and maybe feel the same way. When I went to the academy as a for a customs inspector, I was indoctrinated as a regulator, a law enforcement regulator, to go out and enforce laws and find bad actors and, arrest individuals and seize narcotics. So now I fast forward and I find myself in headquarters at various leadership positions, and now Commissioner Burson joins the agency. And it was Commissioner Burson who reminded me, with his level of intellect that was far beyond mine, just a brilliant individual, that national security is just not physical security. It's also protecting, I think what every one of us alluded to, was the economic competitiveness and prosperity of the United States. And that he said to me, Al, you need to balance that. Do you want your legacy to be, the number of people you arrested or seizures made, or do you want your legacy to be a balance that we were able to protect the country both from bad things and bad actors, but also support the country in continuing to have that economic viability? And it quickly made me rethink that how many of my colleagues don't have the benefit of being now mentored by Commissioner Burson and being informed. And I'm only saying it because I swore to him that I would pay that forward and remind my colleagues that you have this dual responsibility of being sensitive to whatever enforcement protocols you put in. Make sure, we used to say in the Customs Service, you do no harm to the legitimate trade and travelers, because 99% of all the cargo and people coming into the country are legitimate. And it was our role to find those bad actors or those bad things in that haystack of legitimate commerce.
So one of the things that I would like to talk to the three of you about is, how did this impact your career path? I know for myself, obviously I was working in the Southwest and I couldn't get to headquarters fast enough because I felt like I needed to be helping. I needed to be hands-on in the rebuilding of our country, in the building of this new organization, in the development and the implementation of our new mission. So within a few months of 9/11, I was at the Commissioner Situation Room, where we were, for the first time, bringing in all the information of what's happening in this new thing called CBP in every 24-hour cycle, and briefing that to Commissioner Bonner at the 8 o'clock stand-up every morning, and talking about what was going on in San Ysidro, what happened in Windsor, what happened in Chicago, what happened in Long Beach. And so he wanted to know everything was going on in a day of yesterday in Customs and Border Protection. And as my career progressed, I found that extending our borders, and Ron alluded to it, you talked about the supply chain, going as far back into the supply chain to start implementing and validating security measures. Because we started talking about how the border used to be our first line of defense, but we quickly realized that it was actually the last line of defense in keeping our country safe. And so I kind of immersed myself in all things expanding the border and pushing our borders out. But for the three of you, and we'll start with Mr. Bartoldus, how did that change your career path as you saw it? Because I think Mr. Gina alluded to it, that you were sitting in a pretty good situation prior to 9/11.
I had my dream job prior to 9/11. I was the district director of Baltimore, something that many customs inspectors and CBPOs dream of, to be in charge of your own operation away from Washington, D.C., and to be able to be there with the people and the cargo and to be doing the work. On 9/11, my family lives in the Washington area. We never left Washington. I commuted up to Baltimore every day. So like you talked about, Erik, the connectivity, trying to see what was going on. When we moved our operation to the cargo warehouses on 9/11, the only TV we had was a portable with a little antenna, and that had a very foggy image on it. We could hardly see what was going on. In moving from downtown Baltimore to the cargo location, I was able to finally get a phone call through to my wife, who couldn't hear me and told me that there were F-16s overhead and she needed to hang up, and she hung up on me, and I thought, well, at least she's alive. The police then pulled me over because I was one of the only cars on the road at that time of day. So connectivity was all very difficult. I drove home and passed the Pentagon on the way home and saw the fires. I knew I had to get back to DC, but I also knew I needed to finish out my time in Port of Baltimore. Mr. Gina and I lived about a quarter of a mile apart. I saw him regularly in the park and his wife regularly, and knew that my time would come to come back to DC. So they brought me back to Office of Border Security where I wanted to be. We soon turned into the National Targeting Center, and I was honored to serve Mr. Gina, Mr. Commissioner Bonner, and the men and women of the National Targeting Center. We needed to change and to establish a national program from the ground up and to make it effective. And I believe now something that many other countries are emulating was a great honor, and something that ultimately led to me becoming part of DHS, the larger DHS, working abroad, and then ending my career at the White House on the National Security Council. So all of this, I think, was a result of 9/11, learning that data is important in the center of what we need to do, and using risk management both to keep trade flowing and to identify outliers. I was honored to be part of this, but needing to be back to DC was a key part of the reaction to 9/11 for me.
Mr. Gina?
Well, first I'd like to note, I'm glad Mr. Bartoldus finished by saying he was honored, because he started by saying, I crushed his dreams. And
Which you did.
most people know that Mr. Bartoldus and I are probably as close as brothers. So I was hurt that he said I crushed his dreams, but he was the right person at the right time. And I think most would say that it was the agency, and it was really Miss Bonnie Tischler who had the final say. She was our assistant commissioner. And I think she made a great choice by bringing Charlie back to do that. You know, I think, Eric, what it brought to mind while Charlie was talking and you had asked him the question is, it changed my professional career by fully understanding what it means to serve at the pleasure. I had spent my first 15 years in uniform in the field at 3 different locations, JFK, Jacksonville, and Orlando. Came to headquarters in '96, expected to only be there 5 years, and then go back to field locations. And then all of a sudden 9/11 happened, and I was asked, I can honestly say the next 15 plus years of my career, I did not put in for a job. I was either told, volunteered, or requested with kind of the tone that says you really can't say no, and held various different jobs. But as Charlie alluded to, it was a blessing that I was able to serve at the pleasure and do my small part for such a meaningful mission. And, you know, as was alluded to, just being able to help change the whole mindset. I mean, you were sharing with us, Eric, you know, what kind of tools and capabilities. And I guess when you went to check to make sure you never cleared or encountered any of those terrorists, I'm assuming then you kept your index cards in your shoebox that you had to go check on your desk. Well, Charlie, Ron, and I all worked in an environment where you used a buck knife, because you knew if you broke the tip of the buck knife, buck would replace your knife free of charge. And your other tool was a wire hanger that you kind of just unrolled and used to try to detect false bottoms of things.
You're giving away our secrets.
Sophisticated way. And I think what I highlight that for is because I think the whole change towards realizing we had to embrace technology, we had to get smarter. And, you know, even if there's something else that's left to do, I really believe I was engaging with somebody not too long ago, and it was on the issue of artificial intelligence. And I think what I embraced was the fact that the way they put it forward is they said, artificial intelligence just makes smart people smarter. there is no way that the human being can process the amount of data and information, and now that we're into e-commerce, in any manual way. They have to embrace the technology that's out there that maybe we're just not comfortable with. And I'll just close with this. That means the managers of today have to really embrace the younger people coming out of the colleges with those skills and knowledges, and not try to enforce the way they did business onto this generation. Going to Chief Aguilar, I think I remember him always giving us the lecture in headquarters that we need to be preparing for the battlefield of the future, not be preparing for the battlefield of the past. So,
Ron?
Yeah, so just real quick, much like Al, 17 years in uniform, crawling around cars and airplanes and on vessels. And then directly after my pre-clearance assignment, much right on the heels of 9/11, I was able to get very fortunate and start in the ground floor with the Ctpat program, which was the first opportunity for me to understand the world and understand how things come and go, and what really customs is, what it means to have an international, supply chain. I visited 37 countries representing the Ctpat program. I visited hundreds and hundreds of supply chains all over the world, worked with many different governments and customs administrations and private sector folks. Then I concluded my career, again, Eric, you're familiar with this, as the CBP attaché to Canada at the U.S. Embassy in Ottawa. And I can remember, before I retired, sitting in my office at the U.S. Embassy, thinking back to starting as an inspector in Detroit, Michigan, looking in cars and seizing undeclared cases of beer, and sitting in that seat thinking, this is an incredible journey that I've been given an opportunity that I embraced. And again, some negative things made this course possible, but to have that kind of opportunity and exposure and become, Al kind of said it, more worldly and more understanding of there's a lot more to the picture than what you see. And I'm proud of the work that I've done. I'm very proud of the relationships that I forged, these fantastic people that I'm looking at on the screen. No other opportunity in the world could match that. But I just think it's one of those things where, to conclude, Al says, the young folks, I think we're in a period now where it's a dual mentoring process. I think we still, as those who have experience, owe it to younger people to provide that experience, but also kind of learn from them, how do you operate a computer? When I started in customs in '87, we didn't have computers. We had the old teletype. When there was an NCIC or an alert came on, you'd hear the teletype in the back and you'd tear off the paper like Hawaii 5-0, the old one. But so technology comes along, and to be good at our jobs and to continue to impart our experience as veterans, we need the assistance of the younger folks who have that intelligence to continue to be ahead of the game, to embrace technology and be successful. But, the career path I was given, I can't think of any better way to have served and been a part of this.
Absolutely. So I think from our earlier discussion, we can all agree that we can't allow ourselves to become complacent. We can't allow ourselves to forget, but we also need to find a way to bridge the gap between where we need to go and what we need to protect ourselves from, which are sometimes mutually exclusive, and how we learn from our mistakes in the past. So I'll open up the floor for any closing comments.
I'd like to make one comment, Eric, if that's a little.
Sure, of course.
I think we recognize the men and women of the Customs Service of CBP, INS, and the good work they're doing today. They really are. We talked a lot about data management and trade partnerships and working with the people, and everybody plays an important role. We touched on it, but I want to also pay homage to our international partners. Like Ron said, we've all gotten a global perspective. I've had the honor of working in South America Australia, throughout Europe. I was attaché to the United Kingdom, and also in the Middle East, and some great partners around the world who are all looking for the same thing: to protect their people, to live in harmony and peace, move trade and commerce and people around for legitimate travel. So all of those people play a very important role, and I wanted to pay a little bit of homage to our international partners.
Absolutely. Mr.
No,
Gina?
I'll just close with Erik, and it applies to all law enforcement, all intelligence, any individuals who are helping to protect our country. And exactly, I echo what Mr. Bartoldus alluded to, our international partners. But because the four of us happen to all have come recently from Customs and Border Protection, so for those listening, either at the agency or for those listening that may not realize, I'm always very mindful and grateful for what they do and the fact that they're constantly putting their lives in danger in order to protect U.S. citizens and support national security. And I feel like too often I'm having to offer my condolences because people may not realize that since COVID, there have been 45 CBP lives lost due to COVID contracted illnesses. And I think a lot of people do not realize what the Border Patrol, what Air and Marine, what OFO personnel do each and every day. I'm proud to have served there. I'm proud to, still be part of that extended family, but I just want to make sure people do recognize that unfortunately people are losing their lives on a more regular basis than I never ever had to experience. And I constantly try to remind myself and my colleagues and the people we interact with about the sacrifices that agency makes on behalf of the American people.
Absolutely. Ron, do you have anything else to share?
Just again to, be supportive of what we're saying. Those who are basically doing the work now, don't give up. Sorry. Keep at it.
Don't forget.
Don't forget.
That's right.
Absolutely. I think the infrastructure that was built on the heels of 9/11, I think allowed us to do so many different things over the last 2 years now, dealing with the COVID pandemic. And I think because we learned from those catastrophes in the past, I think that the way governments were able to work with the private sector in dealing with the COVID pandemic, because as you were talking, Charlie, earlier, I was reminded of all the different data sets and streams of information that weren't being collected prior to the pandemic that are now being collected to make sure that we can keep this pandemic under control. It's that partnership with the private sector in pursuit of a common goal. And in this case, the stopping of the COVID pandemic. 20 years ago, it was the stopping of global terrorism. Or as it's always been, ensuring economic prosperity for all of our countries. I think it's a tough job. It's a tough mission, but I know that I can say without any hesitation that the people that continue to do it to this day, they are the epitome of public servants.
Yep.
And we've all walked in their shoes, and I'll never forget how hard it was, and I'll never stop appreciating how hard it remains to be, because I think as many of us talked about in the last hour, that we have to be right all the time.
Yeah.
Yep.
So friends, I really do appreciate you taking some time to share your thoughts and your memories with me. I hope our listeners enjoyed it as much as I did. This is an incredible opportunity to be able to bring together, the four folks from different walks of life that were living different lives at that time, but how our lives have intertwined ever since.
Thank you for listening to this segment of CTS Unpacked. For more information about CT Strategies and our team members, visit our website at ctstrategies.com. Connect with us on LinkedIn to share your thoughts or any ideas you'd like to see in future segments. Stay in the loop by joining our newsletter, where we share the latest CTS updates. Until next time, This is CTS Unpacked.